Hello everyone, in this video we will see integrations in ServiceNow. Integrations are integral part of ServiceNow. I haven't seen any ServiceNow instance without an integration. So if you are a ServiceNow developer, you really should know what are integrations and how to do them in ServiceNow and what are the best practices. These are the topics which we will be discussing in this video. I don't want to make this video very long, so I will try to give a gist of each and every topic in this video. If you want to jump to some topic directly, the links will be provided in the description. First of all, about me, I am Harjit Singh. I have 11 plus years of experience and 7 plus years of experience in ServiceNow implementation development. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, YouTube and Twitter as well. Now, what is an integration? It is the ability of different tools to talk to each other and exchange data. So if I want data from tool A to tool B, I can use integration. So you can see there is a source and a target, and source will provide the data to the target. So this is the basic definition of integration, where the source is providing data to the target tool. Next is what is one-way integration or unidirectional, and as the name suggests, it would be one way only. Only one tool will be sending the data and the second tool will be receiving the data. So in this case, if we see, tool 1 is sending data to tool 2. So there is only one-way integration, or we can say unidirectional. Next is two-way integration or bidirectional. So the data would be exchanged between both the tools. So if we see tool 1 and tool 2, if tool 1 is providing data from source to target, that is from tool 1 to tool 2, and then tool 2 is also providing data to tool 1, or we can say tool 2 is the source now and tool 1 is the target. So it's a bidirectional integration where the data is being exchanged by both the tools. Next is what is inbound integration. So we really need to understand difference between inbound and outbound integration. So this is quite important when you are implementing integration in ServiceNow. So what is inbound integration? Requests which are incoming to ServiceNow is inbound integration. If somebody is trying to get data from ServiceNow or trying to insert something new in ServiceNow, that is an inbound integration. In this example, if you see, there are third-party tools like MoogSoft, Jira or any other tool. When they're trying to insert or get some data from ServiceNow, that is an inbound integration. So anything incoming to ServiceNow is inbound integration. Next is outbound integration. Requests which are outgoing from ServiceNow is outbound integration. Whatever request is going out from ServiceNow is outbound integration. For example, if ServiceNow wants to retrieve data from CodeDX or Armor Code or some other third-party tool, then we use outbound integration. I hope inbound and outbound integrations are clear to you. Next is what is an API. API is Application Programming Interface, which is a set of programming code that enables data transmission between one software product and another. It also contains the terms of this data exchange. So basically, API is enabling you data transmission from one tool to another tool. In other words, it is helping you to implement your integration. It's sometimes referred to as a contract between an information provider and an information user, establishing the content required from the consumer and the content required by the producer. There are multiple types of APIs like the SOAP API, REST API, and recently introduced GraphQL. In ServiceNow, mostly we are using REST APIs because those are the best practices. If you want to dig deeper into what is an API, please go ahead and Google that and you will find lots of information, and there would be like 1 hour of videos of just what is an API. For this video, I think this is the sufficient information available here. So as ServiceNow recommends doing REST API integration, what is REST? REST is representational state transfer and architectural style for building web services. So when you're building an API, this is a representational state transfer that interact via HTTP protocol. So it was formulated in 2000 by computer scientist Roy Fielding. So this is all about history when it was created, and it still remains the gold standard for public APIs. So this is the best practice to implement your APIs. REST web service expose API from your application in a secure, uniform, stateless manner to the calling client. So it is very secure and it is primarily stateless. REST APIs give a client access to a representation of state of a desired resource. When called, the server will transfer the representation to the client. Now, for example, if we are calling Twitter API to fetch the list of tweets, that gives us the state of those tweets like users, time, location, etc. And oftentimes we send and receive data in JSON format. So this is quite essential to note, but we can also send or receive data in XML or HTML as well. But 99% of the time we use JSON because it is more easier to use and easier to read. Next is what are REST methods. So there are multiple methods available in REST to retrieve data or maybe to insert data or to update data. The first one is get, and as the name suggests, it will get the data from the resource, and we can see in the description retrieve information about the REST API resource. That is the get method. The next one is post. Post is simply creating a data into the resource. So create a REST API resource, or you can say create a new record in the resource. Put is used for updating the data or updating REST API resource. And finally delete, and as the name suggests, it will be able to delete the REST API resource, or if you want to delete a record in the resource. These are the mostly used REST methods in ServiceNow. So if anyone asks you, I want an API to update the data, so you should know you have to give a put API, and if somebody is asking for inserting a new record API, then you should know it should be a post API, and so on. These are the most important terms which are being used in REST API, so you need to understand these terms, and if somebody in your team is talking about REST API integration, you should know all these terms because they would be used very often. The first one is the endpoint. These are the URI where the caller will send request to. So these are particularly the URLs. The endpoint should be given to the consumers. If you are doing an inbound integration, it would be something similar to URLs like your developer URLs like dev12345.servicenow.com/table/table name, something like that. And basically it just looks like a URL. Methods. So we have already discussed this in previous slide. Methods are the types of request, get, post, put, delete. Authentication. How the API will be authenticated. So when someone is trying to get data from your ServiceNow instance, or you are trying to get data from some other third-party tool that is an outbound integration, how the authentication will take place. There are multiple ways. There is username, password, which is like basic authentication. Then you can use tokens, which uses OAuth. There are so on like API keys, and there are others as well. So just be mindful what are the best practices in your organization, and you have to use that authentication method. Then comes content body. So the information which is being sent along with the REST API when you are trying to send some information through your endpoint or through your API, whatever information you are just sending it to, that is called the content or the body. Usually it is sent with post and put. Why it is sent with post and put? Because you are trying to insert a data, so you need to send some data that what we have to insert, or if you have to update a data, so what are you trying to update. Next comes content type. So what will be the type of payload, or what will be the type of body you are sending, or what will be its format. Like we discussed in the previous slide, usually it is JSON, but it could be XML or some other format as well, but you have to define that in content type. Next comes header. So HTTP headers let the client and server pass additional information with an HTTP request or response. Example, accept, authorization, etc. So if you want to send some additional information, you can use HTTP headers. What are the APIs which are available in ServiceNow? In an inbound request, a third-party application requests an action through a ServiceNow API. What it is trying to say is some third-party application is trying to access some data in ServiceNow, or they are trying to insert or update the data. What are the APIs available in ServiceNow are table API. So these are used to create, read, update or delete records from table. Next one is attachment API. These are used for uploading or querying the file attachment. So whatever attachments are in your ServiceNow, if they want to access those, then they can use attachment API. Similarly, we have email APIs. If we want to send and receive email messages using REST API, then we can use email APIs. If we go into the documentation of ServiceNow, we can see there are many types of APIs present, like account API, activity subscription. I will paste the link in the description of this video and you can go ahead and explore the ones which you are interested in, like aggregate API or the attachment API or maybe CMDB instance API. Next is what is REST API Explorer. So ServiceNow's REST API Explorer is an application to construct and test API requests to a ServiceNow instance. So when you have built your APIs, which we will see in a second, then how can you test that if it is working or not? For that, ServiceNow has provided a tool called REST API Explorer, which is present in ServiceNow itself, where REST API Explorer acts as third-party tool that how it will be calling your ServiceNow and what response it will receive, whether it will be an error, whether it will be successful or something else. So this is quite a powerful tool provided by ServiceNow to test all your APIs. I will just quickly show you this tool on ServiceNow. We are in ServiceNow and I will type REST API Explorer and I will click on this and we will click on explore and we can see this tool as a whole here, and we have multiple options: get, post, get, put, and we have other options available as well, which we will be discussing in a minute. And if you see, we have selected here the table API and other APIs which are available in ServiceNow are all present here. So whatever type of API you want to create or test, that can be done here. Request parameters means when you are requesting something from ServiceNow instance or from some third-party tool, what are the parameters you can send and how you can send. So there are three options available and which we will be discussing one by one. The first one is the path parameter. The list of path parameter depends on the endpoint URL. So this is our endpoint. So this URL. And path parameters are enclosed in curly braces in the endpoint URL. The values set in path parameter field are substituted into the endpoint URL when a request is sent. So these path parameters are enclosed in these curly braces because these are dynamic in nature. So if you want to select the incident table or you want to get data from incident table, you will replace this table name with incident and you would be able to get data from incident, or if it's a post API, you would be able to insert data in incident table. Next is query parameters. Request parameters are added to the endpoint URL by the REST API Explorer when the request is sent. The query parameters are specific to the selected API method. So when you are sending the API request, you can send some additional information for query. For example, if you are sending an encoded query, you can paste it here and it will be sent along with the API. And it says it depends on what type of API method is also being used. Let's quickly see this in ServiceNow as well. If I go here and I check and I click get, we would be able to see the query here, and we can put a limit using sysparam limit. How many records do we need? Like if we are testing, we can test it with 1 record only or maybe with 10 records. Next, if we select post, all these query parameters will change. Now we have display value, exclude reference field, and we can see the description on the right hand side as well. And finally, the third one is request headers. Request headers define the format of the request and response. We will be defining what is the format of data in which we will be receiving and requesting both of them. So if we are sending data in JSON, and for example if we are receiving it in a plain text file or maybe in an XML, then we can define that as well in our REST API Explorer. Now let's quickly test an API here. I will go to my ServiceNow and let's try getting some records from our incident table. What I will do is I will select the table name here as incident, and then I can put a query as well, or I can leave it blank and it will pick up all of the records in ServiceNow. Then if we want any specific fields to be returned by this API, let's do it number or short description and maybe priority. If we don't define any field here, it will return all of the fields which are present on the incident table. I will save this, and how many records I need for testing, I could get only one record or maybe 10. Let's do it for 10 records, and then we are ready to use this API. I will scroll down and we can see a send button here, and as soon as I click on this send, it will send the request to my this ServiceNow instance and it will retrieve the information on the incident table. So if you remember, this REST API Explorer is like a third-party tool which is trying to access data in this ServiceNow instance, and this is what it receives. It receives 200 OK, and this is the response. It has received 10 records which has the incident number, the short description and the priority. Now if you want to add or remove more fields, you can use the query parameters for that, or if you want to change the number of records, you can also do that from query parameters. And now if you want to provide this URL or the endpoint to some other person so that they can access this ServiceNow instance data, you can just copy and paste this and give it to them, and they will be able to retrieve data from the incident table. Be sure to provide them authentication details as well. So out of the box, it is basic authentication. So you will have to provide them a user which can access the REST API calls and data on incident table, and they would be able to do that. We did not provide any authentication here because we are in ServiceNow itself, but it is acting as a third-party tool. So no authentication is required here. Also, if we want to create a new data or a new record in ServiceNow, we will select post here, and I will again select the name of the table as incident, and then we will have to provide the data which we have to insert. And for example, if I have to insert short description as this is a REST API test ticket, and we can provide additional fields as well, for example caller, and then we have to give the sys ID of that caller. Now for example, if I go to users table and I will copy one of the users sys ID, let's copy able tutors sys ID and I will paste it here, and I can add more fields on incident table if I want to. One thing to note is I have requested the format in JSON. So the request is being sent as JSON, and the data which would be received will be in the JSON only. I will go ahead and click on send, and it says modifying data. It means it is trying to insert the new data. I will say okay, please go ahead and do that. And it says 201 created. So that means the record has been created in ServiceNow, and this is the record which has been created in ServiceNow in the response body. So that response has been received by ServiceNow. And if I go in incident list, I should be able to see that record as well. And we can see it at the top. This is a REST API ticket and the caller is able tutor. We will see what are the responses in API. There are HTTP, status code, response headers and response body. So whatever we saw the status codes like 200, 201 on our REST API Explorer here. So these are the status codes. They signify the status of the response. Like if it is 200, it was okay and it was able to retrieve the data. 201 is like it was able to insert the data, and there are many others. So according to the HTTP response status code, you would be able to determine what happened at the tool when you send that API request. If your response status code starts with 1 and then maybe 100,101, so it's an informational status code. And if it starts with 2, like in our case it was 200 or 201, so it was a success. Whatever you were trying to do, it was successful. And if it starts with 3, it means it's a redirection. If it starts with 4, then it's a client error, like you might have received 404, which is always a client error. Or if it starts with 5, that means it's a server error. So just remember all of these basic things, that when you are receiving that status code, you should know what kind of error is that and how to deal with that. Or if you are getting a successful message, you should at least know that I was able to successfully run that API. Then comes the response headers. The headers section shows the return headers and their values. These are the metadata which you receive from the source tool. For example, like the server was ServiceNow, is logged in is true or not, or the date or the content type. So these are some essential information, or you can say metadata information, which has been provided by the response headers. And finally, we have the response body, which we saw at the bottom. So this is the response body, and it's again in the JSON format, and this is what we received from our ServiceNow instance when it was able to insert the data, or when we were trying to get data from this instance. The response body is the data object returned by ServiceNow web service provider. The response body varies depending on the selected API. I hope request and response are clear for these integrations. Next is, how can we add security to your inbound request? So when somebody is trying to access data from your ServiceNow, or they're trying to insert data in your ServiceNow, how can you implement some security layer on that? The first way is to create a user specifically for that inbound request. So you will go ahead and create a user which will have only web service access only. So nobody would be able to directly log in through this user. It will just be used for integration purposes. So this is one method which you can use to implement the security. The next one is disallow web service access to tables. Now what you can do is, don't provide access directly to your tables. By going into tables and under application access tab, you can remove this checkbox, and web services or the API calls would not be able to insert or update data or even read data from these core tables. So if you think there is some specific table from which you don't want to provide data to any third party tool, then you can use this option as well. And finally, we have the course rule. When you define cross-origin resource sharing rule, the value you enter in the domain must meet certain requirements. Each course rule supports a single wildcard to match incoming origin headers. So this is also one of the options which is present in ServiceNow to implement security on the inbound requests. You can find more information on this in ServiceNow documentation. Code samples. The REST API Explorer creates code samples for integrating with ServiceNow APIs in several commonly used languages. So when you're trying to integrate with ServiceNow through some other language, there might be a possibility the third party tool like CodeDX, MoogSoft, or any other tool, they might not be using JavaScript only. They might be using Python, Ruby, Perl, PowerShell, or any other tool, and they want to retrieve or insert data in ServiceNow. So ServiceNow provides them a sample code to get started with integrating with ServiceNow. I'll just quickly show that in ServiceNow REST API Explorer. I'll go here and I'll scroll up a bit, and we can see here code samples. And if I click one of them, for example Python, so I can provide this code to the Python guys to get started with integration with ServiceNow, where the username and password has to be provided by us to them. And then this is how the headers would be sent in the Python language, and this is how the response would look. And if response is not 200, then this is the status which would be printed at their Python tool. And here we are trying to decode that JSON which we have received in the Python tool. So this is just a code snippet to get started with integration with ServiceNow. We will explore more about integration in further videos. This was all basics about integration in ServiceNow. I hope this video was helpful to you. Please let me know in comments if you have any questions or suggestions. I will go ahead and create further videos on this to explain deeply integrations in ServiceNow, and hopefully we will see some third-party integrations in action as well. Thanks for watching the video.